So one of the things I want to do with the talk today is to give an idea of what sorts of issues motivated women into activism, whether it was political activism or any other kind, in the period from 1900 until the end of the Second World War. And in many ways, this is going to be a conversation that's mostly about 1900 to 1920, and that'll make sense in a little moment, I hope. One of the things I want to stress, though, from the outset is that there is probably a perception that this period is a period in which the struggle is about women's right to vote. And that is true, but it's also about a lot of other things. And that's really what I want to talk about today. So first of all, it's worth taking a moment to think about the overall position of women in society in the period, particularly thinking around 1900 at the beginning. Now, there was a steady increase in married women working, as you can see on the slide, or rather, white women working. When overall married female employment was 6.6%, a full quarter of African-American married women were working. Now, which means that when you back that out of the overall total of 6.6%, probably white female employment married women was under 5%. Even more single women worked, though. Again, this was much more a feature of the lives of African-American immigrant women than native-born women. Now, I think that's important because it means that these constituencies, as I'll show, have very different sort of concerns and what they want to see change in American society. Also, while divorce was rare, it was largely at the choice of women, and much more common in Western states like Nevada, which allowed more grounds than adultery. So, for example, many Western states allowed for abandonment, cruelty, things like that as a reason why women could initiate divorce proceedings. But in some ways, I think probably 8% even is likely to be surprising, because that for 1905, that sounds like a fairly high percentage. Now, it's worth talking about rural women for a couple of reasons. First of all, many, if not all, rural women worked on the family farm, and that fact is not counted in the rates of female employment noted earlier. In other words, it's always worth saying that when you see information about women's working, these statisticians who are talking about that aren't counting women who work on farms, and they certainly aren't counting women who work in the home, which at this period of time, remember, is incredibly hard work. But for rural women, life was hard and isolated. Homestead farms, so the farms that most people had, certainly west of the Mississippi, but even in a lot of the Northwest, the area of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, the original homestead farms were about 160 acres. But pretty much that changed fairly quickly to 640 acres. Now, to give you an idea of what that is, that's a square mile. Now, if you're going to farm a square mile with just horses, you can imagine there's considerable manual labor involved. And that's going to be manual labor by anyone in the family who can participate, including women. For most women, indeed most rural families, social life revolved around the church. It is hardly surprising, therefore, that women activists in the rural part of the country were focused not really on things like the right to vote, but on the one thing that they considered to be the most dangerous to families: drink. Rural women, despite urban and Eastern ridicule, led the drive first for abstinence and then prohibition. At times, they physically destroyed saloons. Carrie Nation and her axe show the pride these women took in their activism, which was, as I suggested, at times violent. And so rural communities are driven in activism, particularly by women, in an attempt to stop the thing that they saw as the greatest threat to rural family life, which was drink. The lot of urban women, particularly working class women, was different. They often lived in cramped, unsanitary conditions with multiple families and lodgers. My own grandmother, who came of middle-class Maine stock, moved to New York City at the age of 18 with her younger sister to get away from an abusive stepmother. She lived in Brooklyn, in a Brooklyn boarding house when she was working as a telephone operator in Manhattan. Also, unlike rural America, urban America was very diverse. That same boarding house my grandmother lived in had people from 4 different nationalities. Although immigration from Asia was largely stopped before the First World War, mass immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe boomed, including many Jews fleeing Central and Eastern European pogroms. For these women, working in housing conditions, as well as the general demand to be heard as immigrants, were the leading cause of activism. In other words, while they had an identity as women, their overarching identity may well have been as immigrants of particular immigrant communities. And in fact, rural women, in addition to prohibition, tended to be nativist, staunchly opposing immigration. They were concerned about the influx of Jews, but in particular, they were very concerned about the influx of large numbers of Roman Catholics. And as I've already suggested, the lot of African American women's was very different. It was much more work-centered. Considerably higher numbers of African American women worked, whether they were married or single. In fact, to survive, for their families to survive, they had to work. And they had to survive in the face of legal and societal segregation. One of the most appalling examples, most Black women were called by their first name, denied the dignity of a title, even when married. They were more likely to face sexual violence and often forced to use unisex facilities. The idea of gender-neutral toilets is not new for African Americans. But this segregation and need to work produced opportunities that, in a sense, weren't as available for white American women. Interestingly, as they were barred from many traditional female roles, they were pushed either to the bottom, domestic service, where the most worked, or the top, to the professions serving their own communities. And you can see the percentage of Black doctors who are female is 13% compared to 6% of white doctors. The same, even in some ways, a much greater percentage when you talk about lawyers. Though, of course, these numbers are small. The vast majority of African American women worked in service roles, particularly domestic service. In urban America, the hard lives of women led to trade union activism in industries employing mostly women. And in particular, this was the clothing industry where women, mostly immigrant women, worked in sweatshops. And you can see from the image this sort of immigrant element of it. You know, this abolished slavery, but you can see this is a group that is also writing in Hebrew. So this is a protest by Jewish workers. Again, the emphasis in urban America was working conditions. This led to female-led strikes. In general, women were more able to strike because the authorities and police were less willing to crack down on marching women with violence than they would on, say, steel workers or coal miners. And so you can see these kind of marches and these number 20,000, 60,000, 80,000 marching up Fifth Avenue. The reality is 80,000 male workers marching up Fifth Avenue would have probably been met with police and the army. It would have been seen as potentially revolutionary. And finally, it's also worth remembering one of the other professions into which many women were forced, prostitution. Muncie, Illinois, then and now considered the archetypal normal American, middle American town, in the 1890s had a population of 11,000, but 24 brothels and over 100 prostitutes. In Muncie and in many other cities across America, and particularly small towns, there were repeated attempts to close these brothels using licensing schemes, led on the one hand by religious and social conservatives, moralists, who were appalled at the sin of prostitutions, and feminists who were appalled at the degradation. Also, many single women, especially in cities and small towns, turned to prostitution occasionally when times were tough, particularly single women. And it's very interesting to note that the one state that still has legalized brothels is Nevada, which is also the state which historically had the laxest divorce laws and the laws that allowed you to get married without any sort of a waiting period. So The West, while it was rural and very prohibition focused in what women did, also was a very peculiar place when it came to all other kinds of things. For example, tended to support or at least tolerate brothels, at the same time made divorce a whole lot easier for women. Of course, from a historical perspective, voting is seen as the key issue in the period leading up to the end of the First World War. Now, in part, that's because prohibition, which at the time would have been seen as the other female issue, is now seen as a mistake. So I want to focus for a moment on suffrage. In general, there was a twofold approach. Some argued, some women campaigned for changing the US Constitution, but by design, that is difficult to do. Others tried to change the situation in states. Effectively, they were going to force the federal government to simply allow it by states allowing women to vote, since states control who is eligible to vote unless the Constitution says otherwise. And by 1914, 10 of the then 48 states had allowed, and I think saying allowed is the appropriate word, they allowed women to vote. And let us not forget that by design and practice, and in some cases Supreme Court decisions, US and state constitutions largely assumed that a real citizen was a white man of some property. Now, this drive for suffrage by 1911 had already produced a backlash. Religious leaders, and quite often money pouring in from the drinks industry, were opposing women's suffrage. And the drinks industry was opposed because they thought these women would vote for prohibition. And so you get this response that says that voting will degrade and debase women from their proper role as homemakers and mothers. And you see this in the poster here on the slide. You can have the vote and you end up on the street corner. That's really the text there. Which do you prefer? The home or street corner for women? Effectively, suffrage will turn every woman into a streetwalker, is what the opposition is saying. Indeed, we mustn't forget that both those arguing for and against suffrage, women's suffrage, were using to us, really strange arguments. Those opposed said that waiting in line and the stress of thinking about politics would physically injure women. They would miscarry. They would stop producing milk. That being in public like that, waiting in line, would make women open to sexual assault. In other words, you need to protect women by keeping them from the polling booth. But now, to us, that seems strange. But the arguments on the other side are really equally strange. Those wanting the vote said it would produce a utopia without war, as no mother, daughter, or sister would ever vote to send their male relatives to their deaths. Women were, because of a different character, seen even by many women as superior to men, or rather more civilized. So you get these quite strange arguments both for and against suffrage. In actual fact, what research at the time after women got the vote, and what had showed in Britain as well, is that women tended to vote the same way their husbands and fathers did. A Labour voting household just got more votes. A Conservative voting household just got more votes. There wasn't a lot of differential in how men and women voted. We see that has changed over time. And as I've said, there were a host of other issues which we tend to forget, but which had a direct impact on women's lives and about which they campaigned. And many of these, as you can see, were focused around children and workplaces and housing. So it's women's groups, not entirely, but largely, who are arguing for pure food and drug acts. In other words, that the government regulate the food trade. They're promoting exercise. They're campaigning for the reform of female clothing, making it less restrictive and less weighty. They're arguing for female prison officers. Prisons for women had really, up until this point, had male prison officers, which, as you can imagine, all of the problems that led to. Improving tenements, so they're arguing for housing. They want parks, municipal reform, child labor laws. So these were bound up with women's suffrage and prohibition, but they were a whole range of social demands designed to make life better for women and also, importantly, for children. Now, these demands led to the creation of a plethora of movements, many of which focused around people who had an identity that was similar other than just being women. In other words, there weren't a lot of groups that were pan women, in other words, women from all different kinds of backgrounds. Rather, you had lots of women's groups arguing for the same thing. So, for example, you see the list here. You get organizations that are Jewish, that are African American, that are Christian, that are college educated, that are very posh. That's the Daughters of the American Revolution, about as posh as you can get in American society. And sometimes they will have different emphases and different goals, and sometimes they will work together. But interestingly, it is easier to organize women this way than to suggest that you're going to have an organization that's going to involve a daughter of the American Revolution and a Jewish worker in a sweatshop. They might all be in New York City. They might all live within a couple of miles of each other, but their identity is not entirely just as women. And it produced real radicalisms. And a perfect example is the movement for birth control. Margaret Sanger wanted families, and by which she often meant men, to be able to decide how many children to have. Remember, for birth control in this period is condoms. It's not the pill. It's not until the 1960s in the pill that women get control, really, of their own fertility. But she opposed abortion, and she rejected eugenics, but she often used the image of the poor and the mental deficient to argue for birth control. So the rhetoric was full of eugenics, even if the policies weren't. Now, much of this radicalism was based on a very negative view of men and a utopian view of women, as I already said about the argument for suffrage. As Gilman says here in this extract, we find maleness in its absurdist extremes in war. Here is to be studied the whole gamut of basic masculinity, from the initial instinct of combat with the loudest possible accompaniment of noise. I must admit, thinking about that, when I was preparing this, I thought about the parades and all of the noise associated with the coronation. That would be seen by someone like Charlotte Gilman as a very male thing. So she's saying war is male. Now, you might answer quite legitimately, tell that to Golda Meir, Indira Gandhi, or Margaret Thatcher. But that's a discussion for another time. Now, the American suffrage movement takes its lead from British suffragettes, not necessarily in the violence, but in the activism on the street and the nonviolent resistance. So they picketed, and Wilson, that great figure arguing for self-determination of peoples, had them arrested. Oh, and it might be worth remembering that Wilson also segregated the federal civil service and disbanded the all-black regiments who dated back to the Civil War. But the key thing is by 1920, women had won on the two key things they had been campaigning for the better part of a generation: the vote and prohibition. The reality was war didn't end and organized crime was born. So the question for many is, what next? Organizations and individuals were left looking for a cause, as one person put it. After we got the vote, the crusade was over. It was peacetime, and we just demobilized. Interesting, using the language of the First World War. It's 2 years after the end of the First World War. Now, they had plenty of things to campaign for, but some women just went home and relaxed. But the demands for safer workplaces, healthier homes, better education went on. And first and foremost, though, was the demand to end discrimination. Now, pacifism was a key cause, particularly in the interwar period. It wasn't necessarily led by women, but women were very active in the pacifist movement. But the desire for equality was largely a movement that garnered support amongst women and less support amongst men. In 1921, and every congressional session thereafter until 1972, an amendment for equality was presented. And interestingly, it was presented the first time by Senator Charles Curtis, who was a Republican and a future vice president. And it doesn't pass both houses and go to the states until 1972. And interestingly, by that point, it has moved from being a position largely supported by the Republican Party to a position largely supported by the Democratic Party. At the same time as the activism, individual women were pushing boundaries and providing women with examples and role models. So, for example, Amelia Earhart captures the imagination of the nation with her daring do. And Hollywood in particular provides these role models. Mary Pickford, she isn't just America's sweetheart. Along with her future husband, Douglas Fairbanks Sr., Charlie Chaplin, and D.F. Griffiths, they form United Artists, which I'm sure everyone sees the logo for United Artists in films. Well, that's where it comes from. 4 people banding together to stand up to the movie companies. Theda Bara and others, including Pickford, led the drive to sell Liberty bonds during the First World War. They were the face of the drive to sell Liberty bonds. And of course, Marlene Dietrich regularly appeared in drag at a time when cross-dressing was illegal in most US cities. And we tend to not think about cross-dressing as something that applies to women. But this image that you see here was shocking at the time. A woman not only in trousers, but in a man's naval uniform. Of course, it's always remembered that Charlie Chaplin and Stan Laurel are also appearing in drag in various comedies. Drag is part of acting in this period. However, the one woman who stood out at the time was Eleanor Roosevelt. She was a major figure in campaigning during the Depression and World War II. And we have to remember that after the gains of 1919, 1920, and many women sort of taking the foot off the accelerator, what came next was the Depression. And for many women and many men, it became a matter of survival. And Eleanor Roosevelt is very much campaigning during this period alongside her husband. Now, she still had, in theory, a rather utopian view as women as civilizers. And she certainly put up with a lot. And her ideas about women are, to our minds, quite peculiar. Women had understanding hearts, men had brains. She doesn't divorce FDR when he's having affairs even as early as 1917. She's protecting his political career. But she was also hardworking and hard-headed. And she was very much the public face of the administration. And you see here, leading the charge for human rights on Time magazine. Indeed, Roosevelt's administration, for the first time ever, had women in the cabinet and in positions of power. Mary Dewson was a leading power broker in the Democratic Party. Frances Perkin was the first female cabinet member in charge of labor at a time when many laboring jobs were closed to women. Woodward was put in charge of the WPA, the key building program designed to put people back to work. And most importantly, Mary Bethune brought an African American into the presidential power structure. Admittedly, she was there to deal with African American issues. And let's not forget, many of the WPA programs were highly discriminatory and racist. Still, she was on the cover of Time magazine before Eleanor Roosevelt. It's worth noting that the first woman on the cover of Time magazine was Eleonora Duse, an Italian actress of all things. But the reality is through the 30s and even in the Second World War, the key goal of women and men is really to preserve their position in society. Not just in access to work, but in workplace safety, housing, and education. And for many women, this meant active participation in radical trade unionism. In other words, the trade unionism that argued in the early part of the 1900s, 1900 to 1920, for better working conditions in sweatshops doesn't stop. Not only did women go out on strike, but they were key to supporting men in strikes in all male industries like steel, coal, and automobiles. In many cases, they were not just active, but violent, relying on the reluctance of the police and army to respond with greater violence to women. Historically, this has been the case. We have examples in the medieval period of bread riots in which men went to the bread riots dressed as women because they thought they were less likely to get hit in the head or arrested. So many women continued to agitate for jobs. But let's remember, in supporting trade unions, the trade unions didn't always support them. Trade unions argued contractually for jobs to be kept for men, and most usually just for white men. Still, women felt defending the laboring man was defending themselves. But war and the considerable prosperity that came with it and throughout the 1950s meant gains were limited after the early 1920s. Women worked during the war but often returned to the home afterwards. Male wages, even working class wages, were often sufficient to support a family, and programs for returning servicemen, not though returning African American servicemen, provided free college education and home ownership for millions of Americans of working class backgrounds, millions of men of working class background. Just as in the 1920s, after the success of suffrage, there was a decline in radicalism. The prosperity and domesticity of the post-war period saw a lull in activism. The gains made by women up to the early 1920s were largely static until the 1960s. But those gains should not be overlooked nor glamorized. For every suffragette chained to the White House fence, there was a female prohibitionist chopping up a bar with an axe. Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you. I'm just popping my video back on. Yes, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. I might begin. So I guess like as well, for probably many of the audience of you who've grown up in the UK, that was all very kind of informative and new for me. How does it compare to, I guess, what women were doing in the UK at that time? I kind of felt when I was like listening, I could see some similarities, but I imagine there's some differences as well.
I think there's a lot of similarities. On a number of occasions, Britain is slightly earlier in providing things. It has a much stronger trade unionism, but likewise, trade unionism in Britain argues for jobs to be reserved. There's less of a racial element, not to say that British 20s and 30s isn't racist. It's just that it's just less of an issue because as a percentage of the population, there just aren't as many people who aren't white. So that differentiation of the role of African American women isn't really a feature in Britain. Likewise, the incredible number of immigrants is not really a feature of Britain as well. So there's a complexity to the demands of women in that sort of early part of the 20th century, which is complicated by both race and ethnicity in a way that I don't think you see it on that kind of scale in Britain.
Thank you. I might keep going if people are going to take their time having a bit of a think. I guess you mentioned that Nevada was one of, I guess, the kind of forefront of some of the laws and things that were being made. I guess, can you give us more reasons as to why? And then also on the flip side, were there specific states that were really pushing against any kind of reforms?
Well, the interesting thing is Nevada's not in the forefront. It's just sort of one of the states that's left over. Most Western states tolerated prostitution. They had legalized gambling in saloons, all of these sorts of things. It's just that most of that is crushed by this sort of prohibitionist wing of what women are doing in the course of the late 19th and early 20th century. So Nevada becomes this sort of weird hangover of a Western state that still looks like a Western state. I mean, we tend to forget that most Western states, for example, were incredibly anti-gun. You had to check in your gun when you came into town, that sort of stuff. So the West looked different in, say, 1880. It was a lot less lawful. And so part of what happens is seen by women as a civilizing of the West, of bringing in laws and getting rid of things like casino gambling, of brothels and things like that. And Nevada keeps it, which of course is why Las Vegas ends up being Las Vegas, because it was the one place that still had legalized gambling. Now someone has.
Oh yeah, Elise. So my colleague Elise is on the call, is part of this event as well. She's kindly helping me. Elise is a fellow American, and she said that she especially loved you speaking about the farming. Her great grandmother and her grandma were full-time farmers and full-time mothers in Louisiana. It's a nice comment.
No,
Um,
one of the reasons I said what I did is because I get quite annoyed when I see these statistics talking about women working, and what they mean is women in paid employment. And that's not the same thing as working. My mother grew up on a farm in Illinois, and I can assure you, the women in that family worked, and they worked hard. In fact, I remember once my great aunt Hattie, who was a very short, thin woman, and she had um, 14 live births, one a set of twins, and two miscarriages in her life. And in her 80s, I remember her sitting at the table with my grandmother and my grandfather and her husband, and the men talking about the good old days. And she turned to me and she said, "I hate old men because they talk about the good old days and they don't remember what it was like washing diapers all day, making bread all day, having to get the stove heated up all day." She said, "I love the world of microwaves." So I think particularly for women in the farms, very often they didn't see what they were doing as work in the same way that, say, someone working in a sweatshop saw what they were doing as work. And so they had different desires. It's also worth remembering that a lot of Western states allowed women to vote. So they were a lot less interested in this push for national suffrage because they could vote already. In fact, I think it's Wyoming. When it came into the Union, it already allowed women to vote. And there was an attempt by the federal government to get them to remove the right of women to vote before it could come into the Union. And the Wyoming government refused. So in those Western states, the issues were different. A farmer's concerned, a farm woman is concerned about her husband spending all of the money on the little money they have on drink and going to brothels. A woman working in a sweatshop is concerned about the doors being locked if a fire breaks out.
yeah, that's very interesting. I was going to ask as well, were there states that kind of changed, you mentioned that there was obviously with Wyoming, the federal government kind of tried to push back against that before they were allowed to join. Were there any states who allowed women to vote, who then took that away, who then gave it back, or were they quite consistent? Like once it was kind of given, that was it, and there were no
Yeah.
kind of changes in that sense?
Once they got the state, remember that some areas women could vote in town elections and things like that. And then you get these 10 states by 1914 that allow women to vote statewide in state elections and in federal elections, because if a state says you can vote in a federal election, you can vote in a federal election. Um, all that the federal government does by amending the Constitution is sort of put a minimum bar. So, the Constitution says that you can vote at the age of 18 because states had variable ages. And so that equalizes it in the same way that saying women could vote does that. The post-Civil War ones allow African Americans to vote, though that was taken away and the Supreme Court colluded in that. Those constitutional amendments always remind us of exactly the same thing, that the Constitution, as it's originally written, doesn't think that women or people of color are citizens. You have to amend the Constitution to say that they're citizens. And that's really an important thing. So women winning the right to vote in that constitutional amendment isn't just that they're winning the right to vote. What they are getting is a bit of the Constitution saying they are equal citizens when it comes to suffrage. The point of the Equal Rights Amendment, which still hasn't been passed, is saying that women are equal in other things.
I'll just read out the questions just in case anyone's reading the chat. So got a question that says, you talked about an east-west difference. Was there also a north-south divide?
On race, yes. It's the thing that complicates it there is that the southern states have a very high percentage of African Americans and a very, very low percentage of immigrants. So the issues there are very, very different. For southern states, their governments are less concerned about women voting and much more concerned about African American voting. That's what they want to control. They don't really have a great deal of problem with women voting. They want to be able to control keeping Catholics out and keeping Jews out, things like that. So their emphases are different. In the same way that in the northern states, what they tend to be really concerned about is trade unions. That's what they see as the great threat, and immigrants banding together and sort of making it hard to make lots and lots of money by being mean to your employees. That's a northern issue. It's not really a southern issue.
Thank you. Our next question is, would women sometimes be allowed to vote for state elections but not federally? Also, when were women allowed to have their own bank account?
As far as I know, if you were allowed to vote statewide, you were allowed to vote in the federal elections. I don't know of any state that made a distinction there. The key was getting to be able to vote statewide. Women getting a bank account, I want to say that's late 60s or early 70s, about the same time women are allowed to get credit cards and mortgages and things like that. And it's about the same in Britain and the US.
Thank you. The next one is, it was great to hear more about the lives of Black women and women from other demographics who are often overlooked. I was wondering if you had any more information about their role treatment during the suffrage movement. I recall reading that they tended to be left out of this discussion and that some white women were even against suffrage because they didn't want Black women to be able to vote.
Yeah, so certainly that's an issue in any women's movement in the South, where there's a concern that granting greater rights might spill over into the Black community. So that there becomes a real issue. But I have to say, women's suffrage is largely an issue of white middle class women. Immigrant women are really concerned about child labor laws and whether they have to stand up for 12 hours at work. That's what motivates them. The vote would be nice, but really they're really concerned about housing and workplace conditions. In the same way that for most African Americans, the vote would be nice, but male African Americans can't vote either in the South. And what they're really concerned about is lynchings and extrajudicial violence. So, it's the middle class woman who has the time and leisure to be concerned about a legal right, as opposed to, whether their kids are going to get an education or whether they're going to be, burned to death in a sweatshop fire. So yes, I think one of the things that one of the reasons why I've talked about working class women as well as African American women was to make this point that if you focus on just suffrage, you miss a lot of what women are doing and are concerned about in this period. Everything from Prohibition. I don't know that we really think of that as anything, but at the time it was considered a progressive female-driven agenda. We just tend to think it's weird, which of course it was. But women are very active in a whole range of things. The same sort of problem is if you just think about the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s as Martin Luther King Jr., you're missing out a lot of what's being demanded. There was a demand for legal equality and the removal of legal discrimination, but there were a lot of African Americans at the time saying that is not enough. We need the end of societal segregation.
And when you mentioned that there was the change in the amendment in the Constitution, was that for all women, or was that just for like white women, or was there kind of
to vote? You mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the problem with voting in the U.S. Constitution is, in theory, after the Civil War, blacks had the same rights to vote as whites did, but the South had managed to figure out ways to make that difficult. So they would have a poll tax. So you had to pay money to be able to vote, even though a poll tax is unconstitutional. You had to be able to prove literacy. So what would happen is you showed up, and if you were African American, the test was oral, or the test was written down, and the person behind the counter would just say, you failed. So there were all kinds of methods used. And in the end, of course, if that didn't work, they just hanged you. So despite what the Constitution said, and then the Supreme Court in a number of rulings after the Civil War actually not only said separate but equal is okay, they basically allowed these southern states to introduce all kinds of limitations on the vote. So saying that women could vote, of course it meant that black women could vote, but black women were no more able to vote in the South than black men were able to vote in the South. And the discrimination there was not because they were women voting, it was because they were black women voting.
Thank you. I'm just waiting to see if there's any more questions. I can keep my own questions going, but I don't want to hog all the time. Yeah, well, I was also going to ask, I found it really interesting hearing about the kind of the differences between different locations. And I was going to ask if there was any that were kind of more like conservative, but I guess we've kind of touched upon that with you discussing the distinctions between different places. I don't know if there's anything else you can add to that, or if you've kind of summarized that.
I mean, I think it's worth noting that a lot of the support for women's rights and African American rights in this period is actually coming from the Republican Party. I mean, let's not forget the Civil Rights Act passes in the Senate because Republicans overwhelmingly support Lyndon Johnson when a good chunk of his own Democratic senators won't. And the same is true. This is why it's Senator Curtis who puts this in. An equal rights amendment, women's suffrage, had been in the Republican Party platforms for longer than it had been in the Democratic Party's platform, because many Democrats didn't want to see anything about suffrage because it might touch upon suffrage in the South. And so there was a really interesting thing going on there. We tend to forget that until Roosevelt, the overwhelming majority of African Americans who could vote voted Republican because it was the party of Lincoln. And they voted against Democrats because they saw them as the party of the South. So where we tend to think of where is liberal, where is conservative, kind of the map would look very similar, but the party map would look very different.
Thank you. If there's not any other questions, there is still time, but we can conclude things there. I'm just kind of like pausing just in case someone does furiously type and add something in, but potentially we will be concluding there. So thank you very much, as always, for another fantastic and very, very interesting presentation.
Thank
you. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us today.
Yes, thank you.
We've got one more online event before we kind of draw our latest program to a close, and then I'll be busy planning our second set for the second half of the year. I'm sure we will. I will plead with Bill to do another one. But yeah, thanks so much to everyone, and enjoy the rest of your kind of afternoons and evenings, wherever you are. So thank you.
Thank you very much to everyone. Thank you.